Looking at the projections, you've got Oklahoma State projected third, and you think about last year, best defense in the history of Oklahoma State football. A lot of change, though. A lot of players are gone off that defense. Jim Knowles is gone. So one of the things that Ted and I have talked a lot about is them having to change their style on offense as a result of most likely taking a step back
Right.
on defense. Is that kind of how you see it? And what do you think has Oklahoma State projected to still be a really solid team?
Yeah, I mean they were fourth last year on defense. They're projected to fall to 22nd, which I mean it's still pretty ambitious. I think it's a reminder that they might have the best set of defensive ends in the country this year. Just in terms of the two deep, they have four guys who would start just about anywhere, and that's a lovely luxury to have. But outside the front four, obviously, you're losing two incredible linebackers. You're losing two awesome safeties and two awesome cornerbacks. It was just such a perfect kind of combination of talent and experience, and the style they were asked to play. They were so good at it, basically daring the refs to call holding on every single defense on every single pass play, knowing they wouldn't. Very Legion of Boom-esque in that regard. It's clear that the defense is it has no choice but to regress to some degree. But I think what's going to answer any question about Oklahoma State this year is going to be, their offensive shift last year. They were even more power based than they had been, and they've always kind of had a 15 to 25 carry running back on the roster. But the extra leaning on conservative play and running and all that, was that because they just knew they had the defense and they didn't have to take any risks on offense? Or was that because they couldn't air it out on offense? They weren't as capable offensively, and that's why they were playing that way. And I don't necessarily know the answer. I mean, Spencer Sanders is basically every year I was looking at total QBR. Every year he's around like 41st and hasn't really gotten better or worse in the last 3 seasons. But I mean, that's not terrible, but it's not great either. And he still, runs himself into, some YOLO throws here and there, and runs himself into some pressure. And if you have to rely on him more because your defense is allowing a few more points, Kenny Pickett wasn't amazing until he was a senior either. So maybe he's got that potential in him, but it's hard to guarantee that. And that's why I kind of feel like they're going to, they're still going to win 8, 9, 10 games, but I don't see them as necessarily a top 10 team this year.
Yeah. It's fascinating. The flip that basically the whole conference made in like a season and a half. Right? We went from an up-tempo conference where everyone's airing it out, everyone's chasing Oklahoma up and down the field, to where, everyone's defensive minded, slows it down kind of to a snail's pace. And yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see if Oklahoma State can play good. You can't play the style they played last year if you don't have a great defense.
Right.
And if they're going to struggle defensively, they're probably going to have to get more aggressive. And I say struggle, not necessarily struggle. If you can't hold everyone to like 10 or 14 like they did a year ago, you may have to get more aggressive offensively. It's just so interesting to me how the whole feeling of the conference changed. And a lot of that had to do, I think, with experience, specifically on the defensive side. I mean, last year between Baylor, Oklahoma State, and Iowa State, the amount of returning defensive players that they had was unreal. So, I mean, I'm sure that has a big effect on the overall style of the conference.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny. I went to Kansas this spring, did a Lance Leipold piece that went up last week, and I didn't use this for the piece, but it was funny. I was asking them, like, what were your impressions of the Big 12? Because they were coaching in the MAC until May, and they had, they weren't researching the Big 12 just in case or anything. So they walk in the door, they started watching film, they go through the season last fall. They're like, this is not what I expected at all. This was so much more physical. I mean, Oklahoma State and Baylor were physical teams last year. And that was not really what their impressions were when they walked in the door. So that was kind of funny to see. I do figure, I mean, obviously, the fact that the Big 12 loses so much production this year is a reminder. Like, it basically flips from year to year. So last year they were extremely experienced, and that absolutely played a role. I also think, just in general, Big 12 was kind of one of the first conferences to really embrace the spread from top to bottom. That also means maybe they're the first ones to start coming up with some answers for it. And you have what John Haycock has done at Iowa State, and Gary Patterson. That TCU's defense was terrible last year, but before last year, he obviously was very consistently good defensively. Gundy hiring Jim Knowles. Knowles had kind of figured out this physical style at Duke, and it took him a few years to implement it. He needed that experience level, but he still got it. There's still a lot of defensive creativity in the conference too, and that doesn't necessarily end just because the experience levels are down. So I do think offenses are probably going to have a little bit more success because of experience. Still got a lot of good defensive coaches though.
So a defense that really improved throughout the season last year that stood out to me was the team that you've got projected to finish 4th in the conference, and that's Kansas State.
Yeah.
Right. Really settled into that 3-man front scheme. I thought Felix Anudike-Uzomah was one of the best players in the country that no one knows about. And that defense ended up, from a statistical standpoint, being really solid for them by the end of the year. I know Adrian Martinez is the big question mark for that team. Deuce Vaughn's fantastic, but what are kind of your thoughts on K-State as you look at these projections heading in the year?
Yeah, I've really confused Kansas State fans on Twitter this offseason, because one week I'm like, man, I'm really talking myself into this team, and then the next week I say really nice things about Kansas. But then I think, it's really easy to talk yourself into K-State. This is what was it, like 17 or 18 points per game over the second half of the season, what they allowed. And I had an impression that Anudike-Uzomah was good. You watch him and you're like, wow, this guy's pretty good. I didn't realize we're talking about 11 sacks and he took part in 17 tackles for loss. He was good against the run too, even though he's only 250 pounds. He was just top to bottom, like statistically one of the best defensive ends in the country last year. And that's not something I was really. Daniel Green kind of caught up to me too in that regard. They were making a ton of disruptive plays. This is a very Kansas State. It's really easy to generalize based on what we saw at the end of the Bill Snyder era. It's a collective. They're playing a lot of walk-ons. They're very smart. All the little backhand ways that we had of saying they don't recruit very well. Kansas State, obviously they're not lighting the world on fire from a blue chip recruiting standpoint, but in terms of star power, do they have the most in the conference? Like, just get the guys we know are absolutely fantastic, because they've got Deuce. I realize Brooks and Knowles in the receiving core, they're probably better return men than they are, but they're still good receivers. But they've got the two guys in the front seven too, who would start for just about anybody. They might have the most genuine, like, just individual star power in the conference, and that alone makes them a threat. Plus the schedule, you start with 4 home games in 5, you get Oklahoma State and Texas at home. You can really talk yourself into Kansas State, I think.
Yeah. Interesting. I think this year so far, it's just commitments. They haven't signed them yet, but like right now they've got committed the 1st and 2nd rated players in Kansas, which they have never ever signed the 1st and 2nd best player in the state, in their own state, which is crazy to think about, as good as they've been at times. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
What about Adrian Martinez? I'm one of the guys.
What a response.
What about him?
I'm one, and maybe I don't know what it is, but maybe it's kind of like what you're talking about, like our thoughts of Kansas State and how they play, and just kind of methodical and smart. I feel like Adrian Martinez, like on paper, this is the perfect school for him to go play at, but who knows what it's actually going to look like.
Yeah. His stats, obviously he's played 4 years. He got the bonus year, but you step back and look at his stats from the last 4 years to Nebraska. He basically averaged like 2,000 passing yards and 600 rushing yards or so per season. Career 45 touchdowns, 64% completion rate, mobile guy. Clearly, it's because we saw the fourth quarters of Nebraska games last year. he is one of the hardest people in the country to read because in so many ways he is openly, obviously good. And he fumbles and then he throws it's like every mistake he made last year was at the worst possible time. That affects our impressions of him, but it's also not really something that repeats for most players. You know, it was poor timing. Obviously his special teams at Nebraska, like they were just constantly imploding and constantly putting him in an awkward situation. I mean, well, Kansas State, they weren't amazing on special teams last year, but year to year, they're just about the most consistent special teams team on the planet. It feels like this is such a much better situation for him that it's not going to necessarily matter that he fumbled with 3 minutes left against Michigan or whatever. Like it's all circumstantial, the things that are I guess cons on his pro con list, but the pros he's been showing for a long time. And you do figure that his mobility, the efficiency that he can play with, that's going to pair perfectly with Deuce Vaughn in the backfield. That seems like a great marriage right there.
Yeah, and we'll see if Colin Klein could get the most out of him. Okay, we